For today's video, I'm going to share how you can easily prevent old tank syndrome and aquarium acidification, two problems that can cause your tank to crash and wipe out your fish. I've had a few people ask why this has never been a real issue in my setups, and the simple answer that in most of my tanks, plants and microorganisms handle it naturally, and in others, regular partial water changes keep everything balanced. As always, you'll find a fully sourced article that goes with this video along with other helpful resources linked in the description. First, I want to talk about what old tank syndrome actually is. Unfortunately, there isn't an official definition, it's more of a collection of symptoms that can develop in an aquarium with very little maintenance. Some of the most common signs include a drop in pH, extremely high nitrate levels, algae blooms, stressed fish gradually dying off, and even sudden fish deaths right after a water change. These problems stem from a variety of different passive processes happening in your tank that over time build up to a point where they become harmful. The good news is that once you understand what's going on, there's both active and passive ways to prevent old tank syndrome entirely so it never becomes an issue in your aquarium. I want to start by looking at the gradual reduction of pH in aquariums. This isn't just part of old tank syndrome either, it is also its own unique problem and commonly referred to as aquarium acidification, which I also get a few questions about. To really understand why this can become a problem, we first have to know what pH actually measures in our tanks. A lot of sources simply say that pH tells us how acidic or alkaline the water is, and while that is true, it doesn't explain the underlying issue. So what pH actually measures in our aquarium is the specific ratio of hydrogen ions to hydroxide ions in the water. The more hydrogen ions present, the lower and more acidic the pH will be. The more hydroxide ions, the higher and more alkaline the water will be. To my knowledge, all variations of the nitrification process where microorganisms convert toxic ammonia into toxic nitrite and then into the far less toxic nitrate also produce hydrogen ions as a byproduct. This means that the very process that keeps our toxic nitrogen levels under control is also gradually releasing excess hydrogen ions, lowering the pH and making the water become more acidic over time. Eventually, the pH can drop so low that it goes out of range of the microorganisms driving nitrification, causing the cycle to start to break down. Exactly when this happens depends on which specific microorganisms are dominating the nitrogen cycle for your specific tank. For example, a lot of sources specifically focus on the more commonly used Nitrosomonas and Nitrobacter strains, which usually thrive in harder, more alkaline water and may start to struggle once pH levels drop below 7.3. In softer, more acidic water, the cycle is often carried out by ammonia oxidizing archaea and nitrospira strains, which can function down to around 6.0, but some nitrospira strains can keep working below that. And in blackwater strains where your pH drops below 6.0, you'll probably see nitrotoga strains which can still operate down to around 5.7. The real danger comes when your pH starts to drop so quickly, often due to a fall in KH range, which I'll cover in my next section. In this case, specifically if your pH is dropping uncontrollably at a rapid pace, there isn't enough time for the different microbial colonies to adjust and take over, which can cause ammonia and nitrite spikes in your tank which can kill your fish. It is worth noting that below pH of 6.0, almost all of the toxic ammonia is converted into the far less toxic ammonium, but the toxic nitrite remains toxic regardless of pH. This is dangerous because nitrite interferes with the hemoglobin in the blood of your fish, turning it into methemoglobin, which can't carry oxygen around the fish's body correctly, so even if your dissolved oxygen levels are high enough for the fish to breathe, it will still suffocate. Now, while all of that might sound a little scary if you are new to the hobby, the good news is that preventing it can be very simple and easy. The most common solution is to perform regular partial water changes in your tank. This helps remove the excess hydrogen ions from your tank and keep the pH stable, usually close to the level of your tap water. How often and how much water you'll need to change will depend on things like your specific stocking levels and how heavily you feed your tank. The best approach, in my opinion, if you are going to rely on water changes is to get yourself some sort of pH test kit, even if it's your affordable dipsticks that are very easy to use, and then monitor your pH readings and adjust your water change schedule accordingly. But water changes are not the only option, and another great way to prevent aquarium acidification and many other issues tied to old tank syndrome is by using fast-growing live plants in your tank. With planted tanks becoming more popular in the hobby, it is important to understand that not every planted tank will give you this benefit. For example, this is my 40-gallon community tank, which is heavily planted, but the plants are mostly slow growers. Because of that, they simply don't grow fast enough to counteract the aquarium acidification, especially in an overstocked setup like this one. Plants such as Anubias, Java Fern, Cryptococcus and Echinodorus are all commonly recommended to beginners because they are hardy and easy to keep alive, but the trade-off is that they are also slow-growing plants that don't really offer benefits when stabilising water parameters. I will link to one of my articles in the description going over the best plants in my opinion for natural water purification. This tank is my 12-gallon golden white cloud mountain minnow tank, and the stocking level is far more suitable for this type of natural balance. However, this is an unheated room temperature aquarium, and that presents another challenge in the cooler winter months because a lot of the plants in here will enter dormancy and basically stop growing until things warm up again in the spring. During that time, hydrogen ions can still build up in the tank, lower the pH and crash the cycle. What we are really aiming for this type of setup is something like this, which is a heated tank kept at a minimum temperature of 22 degrees Celsius or 72 degrees Fahrenheit to prevent plant dormancy kicking in. It's also planted with plenty of fast-grown plants in the background with floating plants on the surface. Here's another aquarium setup in a similar way that's another great example because this combination helps actively remove excess nutrients and hydrogen ions, keeping the stable balanced year-round. So now that we know what type of planted tank works best, we need to take a closer look at how plants actually prevent aquarium acidification. Plants help in two key ways. First, here's what the plant-based aquarium cycle looks like. Across the top we can see that microorganisms are still part of the process, but instead of being the primary system we rely on, they are more of a backup. These microorganisms will be basically mopping up any leftover ammonia or nitrite in the tank and converting it through to nitrate if needed. But with this system, the plants take the lead by directly absorbing ammonium and turning it into plant growth. This means that far less ammonia and nitrite need to be processed by the microorganisms in your tank. Because of that, the colonies of nitrifying microbes stay smaller, which in turn produces fewer hydrogen ions during the nitrification process. If your stocking and feeding is low enough and you have enough of the correct type of plant, technically the microbes in this type of cycle might not be needed at all. So that's step one. The smaller microorganism colonies in the tank mean fewer hydrogen ions are being released. Step two happens because plants don't just passively take in nutrients, they actually help rebalance the chemistry in the tank. As you can see, in the plant-based cycle, toxic ammonia in our tanks is converted into ammonium, which is what the plants use as their nutrient source. That conversion from ammonia to the far less toxic ammonium requires an extra hydrogen ion from the tank's water column. So while the smaller microorganism colonies are producing fewer hydrogen ions, the ammonia present in the tank from the fish waste is using them up to become ammonium and fuel further plant growth. The result is a balanced system where excess hydrogen ions are reduced by creating ammonia, which is then turned into plant growth, and the pH remains surprisingly stable. When used in this way, live plants can create a natural buffer system that prevents aquarium acidification and protects your tank from one of the main symptoms of old tank syndrome without you needing to do anything. So moving on, and we get to the reduction of carbonate hardness, or KH, which I briefly touched on earlier. This too is also tied to the nitrification process, or using microorganisms to convert toxic ammonia into toxic nitrite and then into the far less toxic nitrate. This is because some of the carbonate hardness is consumed in some versions of this process, gradually lowering your KH reading in your tank. Depending on your tank's pH and the specific microorganisms carrying out your cycle, this can eventually cause the cycle to fail once the KH is depleted. From what I've seen and to my current understanding, this issue mostly applies to tanks that rely on the more common Nitrosomonas and Nitrobacter strains of microorganisms, typically found in harder, more alkaline water setups where KH plays an essential role. For softer, more acidic setups like my own, it is a very different story. For example, my tap water comes out with a pH of 6.4, a GH of 4 and a KH of just 3. But even with this tap water, I've never had any problem maintaining the cycle in my tanks, even if I'm using a system that primarily relies on microorganisms in a filter rather than plants. That's because instead of Nitrosomonas and Nitrobacter, with this type of water parameter we cultivate strains like ammonia oxidizing archaea, Nitrospira and sometimes even Nitro-Togoa. To my understanding, none of these require KH from your water column to do the nitrification process, so this doesn't become a problem. Now I know this is somewhat controversial, and I've seen some surprisingly heated debates on social media where the majority of people keep insisting that it's impossible to hold a cycle with a KH below 4 or even 5 depending on the source they're using, but this is 100% not true. As I mentioned, my tap water has a KH of 3, and in my experience the majority of my tanks have a KH level which usually hovers around that without me doing anything. But on top of that, it's extremely easy for you to verify this on your own. All you have to do is find a shrimp keeping content creator who ideally specializes in fancy Caridina shrimp like Taiwan bees, which are very popular in the hobby, and simply ask them what KH they run their tanks at. I'd be very shocked if any of them said anything above a KH of 2, but they can still easily hold the cycle on their aquariums and keep their shrimp safe. The key difference is that we are relying on different microorganism strains that simply don't need a KH to survive. So hopefully, at least with that cleared up, the more important takeaway for this section is that KH depletion usually only becomes a concern in hard water, alkaline setups, and even then it's thankfully fairly straightforward to prevent in your tank. As you might expect, the easiest way to prevent KH depletion is through regular partial water changes. By doing this, you remove the water with a depleted KH level and replenish it with fresh water from your tap that contains more carbonate and bicarbonate carbon compounds, helping to maintain a stable KH in your tank. Another method is to add natural sources of carbonate hardness directly to your setup. This can be done by using limestone-based rocks such as Sirius stone as your hardscape, adding crushed coral to the filter or your tank, or incorporating aragonite to your sand substrate. Depending on your tap water, these might not have much of an immediate effect, but as your KH and pH levels start to drop, they'll gradually start releasing calcium carbonate into the water. When the conditions are right, dissociation will occur and the calcium component will increase your GH reading while the carbonate contributes to your KH reading. This helps replenish both and prevents your tank from crashing. Again, the rate of KH depletion in your tank will depend heavily on your stocking levels as well as how much you feed your tank. The more waste your fish produce, the larger your nitrifying bacteria colony has to be, so the faster your KH will be consumed. In theory, in lightly stocked and lightly fed tanks where Nitrosomonas and Nitrobacter are the main dominant microbes, the bicarbonate buffering system process may help passively replenish your KH levels and prevent depletion, but I'll go into that in more detail in the next section. The next common symptom of old tank syndrome is an increase in CO2 levels, which can cause problems in several ways. Most of this CO2 is produced through respiration, not just from your fish, but also any shrimp, snails, plants, and microorganisms in your tank. This also includes nitrifying microorganisms that help maintain your cycle, as well as waste-eating bacteria that break down organic matter in your tank. On top of that, the decomposition of waste, leftover food, and decaying plant material also adds CO2 to the water. Although it's rare, there are some chemical reactions that may occur in your tank that may also add small amounts of CO2 to your tank, but it's really not a common issue. When CO2 levels build up, two of the most common signs will be fish gasping at the surface and sudden algae bloom, since algae will quickly use that extra CO2 for growth. You may also notice sudden swings in pH due to how CO2 interacts with the bicarbonate buffering system. Again, thankfully this is usually very easy to fix in most aquariums. In most cases, simply creating more surface disturbance will be enough to keep this under control. Aquarium water is constantly trying to maintain an equilibrium with the gas ratios in the atmospheric air above it, so the more surface area which is exposed to the atmosphere, the faster the oxygen and CO2 levels will normalise. Sponge filters, box filters, under gravel filters and air stones are all perfect for this, but anything that'll create surface disturbance such as a hang-on back filter will be able to help with this. These don't just release bubbles into the water to help increase the surface area between the water and atmospheric air. The bubbles hitting the surface also create ripples, which then increases the surface area further by creating sine waves across the surface, speeding up the gas exchange. For non-planted tanks, this is a simple, affordable, reliable way to prevent CO2 buildup and ensure your fish always have enough dissolved oxygen. But if you keep a planted tank, especially one with fast-grown plants, there's another layer of protection you can take advantage of. A lot of people focus on how plants only use CO2 during photosynthesis when the tank lights are on, but then they'll respire at night when the tanks are off and take in dissolved oxygen and release CO2. While this is true, the bigger picture is the more important part, and as I mentioned earlier, plants absorb large amounts of ammonia from the nitrogen cycle. This reduces how much ammonia and nitrite need to be processed by microorganisms in your tank, which keeps the microbial colonies smaller. Because these colonies are smaller, their respiration uses up a lot less dissolved oxygen in your tank while also producing far less CO2. I've seen research papers show that plants have been able to reduce the biological oxygen demand in the test tanks by 75%, simply by lowering the size of the microorganism population needed to hold the cycle. This frees up more oxygen for your fish and significantly cuts the CO2 production at the same time because these microorganism colonies are considerably smaller. There's also a theoretical benefit of the bicarbonate buffering system, but unfortunately, to my knowledge, this really hasn't been tested extensively. Depending on your tank's pH and KH levels, CO2 can potentially get converted into carbonic acid, then into bicarbonate, and then finally into carbonate. Theoretically, in lightly stocked, lightly fed tanks, this pathway may not only reduce CO2 levels, but it can also help replenish KH by replacing essential carbon compounds in the tank. This helps prevent KH depletion that I covered in the previous section, and if you have a higher pH hard water setup, then this theoretically will let your beneficial microorganisms just continue running without you doing anything to actively increase your KH. Don't underestimate water changes if you have an unplanted tank either. It's not just that you're swapping out the water, most water changes create a lot of surface agitation during the water change process, which temporarily increases gas exchange and helps normalize the O2 and CO2 levels in your water. Next up we have nitrate buildup, and while nitrate is far less toxic than both ammonia and nitrite, in high enough concentrations it can still stress or even kill fish. Exactly how much is difficult to pin down since different species of fish have very different tolerances to these nitrogen compounds. But nitrate builds up in your tank as it's the end product of the most common nitrification process in most people's tanks, where ammonia is converted into nitrite and then into nitrate. The problem is that in many people's aquariums there's no natural way for this nitrate to be reduced, so it accumulates over time and consistently increases. In heavily stocked, heavily fed tanks, nitrate levels can climb surprisingly quickly, so this can catch beginners out. For most people, the simplest and most reliable way to control nitrate levels in your tank is a partial water change. Theoretically, this removes nitrate-rich water from your tank and replaces it with water with a far lower nitrate level from your tap. However, the effectiveness of this will depend on your local tap water supply. For example, a survey in the UK found tap water in Greater London contained around 35 ppm of nitrate, but I have had people comment on my videos saying their tap water in that region was as high as 50 ppm. In these cases, water changes may actually make nitrate levels higher instead of lower. But this is where live plants come into action again. As we saw earlier in the plant-based cycle diagram, plants do prefer to take ammonia up as their primary nitrogen source. By absorbing the ammonia earlier, plants prevent it being converted into nitrite and then nitrate, passively reducing how much nitrate is actually produced in the tank. Some ammonia will still make it through to the microorganisms, but your plants will also use nitrate as a second nitrogen source once the initial ammonium supply has been depleted. So this helps reduce nitrate buildup in two different ways. Initially, it lowers the total amount of nitrate produced by using up ammonium, and then secondly, it'll directly use a nitrate source as its nitrogen supply once the ammonium is gone. In my planted tanks, this usually keeps nitrate levels between 0 and 20 ppm, which is comfortably within the safe range. Another less common method of nitrate control is anoxic filtration. Now, anoxic filtration is controversial in the hobby, but two different research teams have used pumice and leca to confirm this is possible, and I've personally seen things happen in my tanks using lava rock, where I do think these specific bacteria strains kick in. The idea is to create low oxygen zones where specialist bacteria strains will thrive, and these microbes work differently than the standard nitrifiers. Denitrifying bacteria convert any nitrate in your tank directly into nitrogen gas, which will then gas out of the aquarium. Anammox bacteria processes both ammonium and nitrite at the same time and turn that one straight into nitrogen gas without nitrate being created in your tank. While these methods have been scientifically proven to be possible, they are more specialist and less practical for a beginner to the hobby. That's why for most people I do think regular partial water changes and fast-grown live plants will be enough to maintain this and prevent it becoming an issue. Next up we have tannin build up. Tannins are a mix of different organic acids that leach into your aquarium water from natural minerals, giving it that familiar yellow to brown tint depending on the specific ratio of the acids in your tank. Over time, these acids will accumulate and gradually lower your tank's pH level, causing similar issues that I covered in the aquarium acidification section earlier in the video. The tricky part is that it's hard to know exactly how much tannin buildup an aquarium can handle before it becomes an issue. On top of that, different tannin sources release very different amounts of tannins. For example, a large piece of bogwood used as your hardscape can continuously release a lot of tannins into your water for years. On the flip side of that though, a single Indian almond leaf will only release a small amount of tannins into your tank until it breaks down. It is worth pointing out that tannins aren't always a bad thing, and a lot of people in the hobby, especially those who keep softwater fish, intentionally buy botanical products to add tannins to their aquarium water. But the main reason a lot of people want to control tannin levels in their tank is simply aesthetic, because they don't like the yellow to brown tint they add to the water. Personally, tannins don't bother me that much, at least in the early stages, but tannin buildup is the main reason I do water changes in most of my tanks. Even then, it usually takes many months before the tint starts to bother me enough where I'll do a water change to dilute the tannin content in the tank. Another popular option is to use filter media like Purigen, which will lock the tannins into the media and keep the water crystal clear by default. There is some research suggesting that tannins can be naturally removed from the water by using specific types of soil and even some strains of microorganism, but to be honest, I really haven't looked into this much because, like I said, at least in the early stages, tannins really don't bother me that much. On top of that, like I said, it is difficult to know how much tannins your tank can take before it starts to become an issue, but I do check the pH of my tanks monthly, and it's very rare that I notice any changes if I'm honest. Like I said though, you can easily control it with water changes or purging so it won't become an issue in your tank. Finally, I want to talk about waste accumulation. This is often the root cause of a lot of old tank syndrome symptoms, but thankfully it's one of the easiest to spot in your tank. Leftover fish food, fish waste and decaying plant leaves in your tank are clear signs that there's organic matter in here that may need attention depending on the type of aquarium you want to run. As these break down, they release ammonia, CO2, tannins and minerals into the water, and while there can be a problem in non-planted aquariums, the ammonia, CO2 and minerals are actually helpful in planted tanks. In a traditional non-planted aquarium, gravel vacuum is the obvious solution to this one, and it can work well as you simply remove all of these organic materials before they become problematic. But in ecosystem style tanks like the ones I personally run, I don't recommend gravel vacuum and I don't do it in any of my aquariums. These tanks rely on recycling as much of the natural nutrients as possible, and gravel vacuuming removes the food source for the waste-eating bacteria that are essential to keeping this type of system balanced. The thing to remember is that waste-eating bacteria are slower to establish than nitrifying bacteria in a lot of aquariums. Although technically some of them do have a very short doubling time, unlike nitrifying bacteria where you're specifically trying to colonize them in your aquarium filter with a lot of surface area and water flowing over them filled with nitrogen compounds and dissolved oxygen. These waste-eating bacteria strains usually have to be in other areas in your aquarium with organic matter as a food source, at least initially, and they might not have enough dissolved oxygen to grow at their optimal pace. This means that it can take weeks before you see visible results in your tank if you're using this method. For example, in one of my recent dirted tank setups, it took 67 days from a standing start when I first set the tank up, which is nearly 10 weeks for the ram's horn snail waste to fully break down naturally. If you don't want to wait that long, you can use bottled sludge-eating bacteria. These usually contain non-pathogenic strains of Bacillus and Pseudomonas that tolerate a wide range of water parameter conditions and will start breaking down the organic matter in your tank. You don't need the huge expensive bottles either, and you can use a small dose to kickstart the tank and things will go quickly from then on, but they will naturally be in your tank anyway, so you don't need these bottles at all, and I don't use them. In the ecosystem style tanks that I keep, these specific bacteria break down the organic matter into water soluble nutrients that your plants use. Because the plants are using these TDS ions, there's no consistent buildup in TDS levels either. The non-water soluble parts of these organic materials essentially become part of the substrate and help enrich that as well, recycling as much as possible in the tank. But like I said, these can take months to build up, so you see a noticeable difference in your tank, and it's not for everyone, especially if you're over on the aquascaping side of the hobby because you just don't want decaying leaves in your tank. So for that, trimming decaying leaves and gravel vacuum may be the best option. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. Thanks for watching and I hope it's been helpful, and good luck avoiding old tank syndrome in your aquariums.